Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. You can follow me on X at Movies TV Mad and on Instagram and on Threads at Movies TV Mad X. A very warm welcome to Saturday's edition of the Movies TV Mad Daily. And today we're committing the total runtime of today's show to Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Now, this is a very, very hard movie to review. So is the first one. And I'll tell you why. Because we're getting a 6-hour director's cut of the first one. Then a 6 hours director's cut of the second one. Which means both movies have been heavily cut. Some of the narrative, probably a lot of the narrative, has been cut from these 2-hour features. Which means it's difficult to criticize it for this or for that, because people are going to say, well, it's been so heavily cut. And this is the problem with the 2-hour, 2-hour 10, 2-hour 15 minutes runtime. Don't forget the end credits are like 7 minutes long. So you're talking basically 2-hour movies. Now, Zach wanted to do a one movie, but Netflix didn't want that. They said it was too long, people wouldn't sit there for that long. And I think Netflix were right, because the Snyder Cut had similar problems on Max. 4 hours. I mean, I sat there and watched it for 4 hours, but your normies are not going to do that. So I get that. So then they had the idea of, cut them down to 2-hour movies, then do 6-hour each director's cuts. Now, the other day I saw an interview with James Cameron saying that should be the future of streaming, where they do these really epic long director's cuts and cut them down to 2-hour movies, and people can choose which version they can watch. That's all well and good if you know what you're doing via the editing. Here's a very, very unpopular opinion about both Rebel Moon movies, and it is that the first movie is the better movie in terms of the cut down movies. I believe that the sequel had many, many problems, unfortunately, because regular viewers here will know I'm a big Zack Snyder fan. I really liked the first movie, and not many people did. I liked the opening scene on the farm. I liked Noble's introduction on the farm. It showed what a badass, what a ruthless SOB he is. So I liked that. And Ed Skrein, if that's how you pronounce his surname, was outstanding. And let's be absolutely clear, Ed was the best thing about the first movie. But here's the thing now, watching the sequel. It's pretty clear what they were trying to do. And there's a lot of me in the first movie in terms of character and story. But when you get to the second movie, this is the ultimate sin for me, because you're stealing from your consumer and your audience and your fans. Because 3/4 of this sequel is filler. And that's undebatable. It's there. They waste the first half of this movie on fucking filler. And it's blatant and it's there. And what's a bigger crime about this? You could have actually spent that on character development. Because here's the thing. Character development doesn't work solely on flashbacks. And this is what Snyder attempts to do with this movie. Tries to fill the gaps with flashbacks. He does the same thing with Cora in the first movie, which works a lot better than it does in the sequel. Doesn't work for me, right? Because here's another unpopular opinion. Because there is a good story in there somewhere. It's there, it just hasn't been executed very well. I say this a lot. Any movie, any art, whether you're painting, singing, playing the violin, is about the execution of what's on the hymn sheet. And if you don't execute that properly, it doesn't matter how well you know how to play the violin or the guitar or the piano or how to direct. It doesn't matter that you understand cameras and angles and what lights need to be shown and how bright the lights need to be shown and what angles and all of that. That's not how you make a great movie, And we have to be honest, Hollywood hasn't really worked as a medium since the 70s. It hasn't. The quality has gone down, and entertainment of today hasn't got the best directors in the history of filmmaking. It doesn't. It doesn't have the best actors in the history of Hollywood. You know, we still got really good production designers. Unfortunately, they're not allowed to do very much practically anymore. We've still got some of the best costume designers, but sometimes in a lot of ways, because of VFX and CGI, I think that gets lost as well. So, you know, they focus on other things. There's a lot of obsession. And, you know, the reason Hollywood's so shit today isn't just because of Hollywood. It's because of the modern consumer as well. This is how I feel. This is how I feel the story of Rebel Moon should have been executed from the first movie. We should start with Cora when she's found as a little girl with that that bad geezer finds her, right? So he brings her up. She becomes this badass soldier for the mother world, right? She does bad things. And we get a brilliant reveal, you know, in the sequel where, you know, that guy who brought her up, he murders the king and, you know, gets her to kill that little child and stitches her up for the whole thing. That's an interesting, good little story. So if you focus on, you know, Cora's time, you know, working for the motherland or whatever they're calling them, the mother world, right? If you focus on all that and that betrayal and everything, and that's the whole of the first movie, that works a lot better. Then the sequel, the second movie, can be focused on the farm, her running away from that life and her being hunted. You know, I think that would have worked for me a lot better. That's how I would have played it. But by Snyder starting on the farm from the very first movie, because he's trying to rush everything along, that's the problem. And everything gets lost in flashbacks. So, you know, in the sequel, you've got this whole, you know, I want everyone to confess themselves, you know, you get the whole, you know, you get that whole thing, don't you? Where everyone starts talking about themselves, and it's not enough. It's a really bad way to develop characters, and it doesn't work, because ultimately, I don't really care about these characters. Now, in the first film, right, I liked Gunner, and I thought, or Gooner, as Sir Anthony Hopkins, is he an Arsenal fan or something? But yeah, I liked that character in the first movie. I thought they developed his character a lot better. And when you get to the confessions, you don't get anything from him because there's nothing there. I mean, I just think the first film was paced better. It was more interesting. It had a good mixture of character and action. And this movie, as I say, first half is total filler. And that's the ultimate sin. I mean, I've got some things written down here as I was watching the movie, right? So, you know, no mention of the father of the farm. You know, the one who gets his brains bashed out at the beginning of the first movie. Actually, the only one who ever mentions him is Admiral Noble, because he's the one who beat his brains out, right? I mean, if you're fighting for anything, surely it's him. The first film, the first half, as I say, total filler. It's outrageous because, as I say, it's not like they couldn't do with some proper character development. Instead of, you know, we're watching them doing the crop, you know, getting on and things like that. And it's the same thing for about an hour or so, maybe a bit less. And that's wrong. And that's a schoolboy error from Zack. The guy with the beard from the first movie, you know, the one Cora was having sex with, right? Do you remember that one? And people were saying to her, yeah, what are you going to get with him? Is it going to be serious? Him. So she comes back with Gunner and all the other people. All of a sudden, her and Gunner are a thing. And that guy doesn't seem that bothered. And then basically, Noble kills him in that fight. And he becomes a pointless character. He's like a sub. He's like a substitute. Now, maybe in the director's cut, we'll get more of him. We'll get a reaction from him about Cora and Gunner. But again, that's not good enough. Because you're cutting so much. Because let me tell you something. When all these idiots are watching these things and hate watching these things and doing reviews for their YouTube channels, they're just going to take any opportunity to shit on this film. And I'm sorry, but the sequel does have a lot wrong with it. Now, as usual, it looks stunning. The action's pretty good. The music in both movies, right, by Junkie XL is absolutely outstanding. I think he's calling himself Tom Holkenborg these days. That's his name, isn't it? He used to go with Junkie XL, but in the credits, he's Tom Holkenborg. So I'm always satisfied, more than satisfied, overly satisfied with Tom's score. But yeah, so this film wastes a lot of time. There's like subplots with the blonde boy and Nemesis, which I thought was really good. I thought Nemesis was a really good character. But again, the character development isn't enough. This is why I feel if the first film focuses from all these characters, stories, brings them together, right? Because that's what this film basically is. In a way, it's a team up. It basically, as I say, the execution of this movie just didn't work at all. This second movie didn't work. Prefer the first movie. And it's interesting, either there's something wrong with me and I know nothing about movies and telling a story, or it's the rest of you. But a lot of people didn't like the first movie. And the reactions I'm getting from Snyder fans who had early screenings are saying, you're like the second movie, it fixes the mistakes of the first movie. I don't actually think the movie made many mistakes. I think the big mistake was where they started the whole story. Because here's the thing, Cora has got a good backstory. She's got an interesting story. She's a good character. The actress is doing a good job. Everyone is doing a good job. The acting isn't necessarily the problem here. It's the way the story's being executed. But I think the first movie is a good movie. It's a solid movie. Look, neither of the movies are Snyder's best work as far as I'm concerned. And I do think that Snyder's the kind of bloke that needs, policing, kind of needs, he needs kind of someone to say, hang on, Zach. He had that with Nolan and Goya in Man of Steel. He had that with Terrio. Because, say what you want about BVS, but Terrio is a great writer. And, Nolan and Goya are really good storytellers as well. But basically, he's leading his own camp here. He's in charge of the whole thing. He even does cinematography. So one of the criticisms we got from both movies is there's too much slow motion. That's because he's in charge of the cinematography. And when Zach's got another cinematographer with him, I think it's more controlled. Because, there's things like in the first movie when she's, pulling her top down or something and it's slow motion. It's too much. I don't mind a bit of slow-mo. It's not my favourite thing in the world, but I don't mind it. But I think he has, gotten carried away with the slow-mo in both movies. For example, is it General Titus, right? He's an or should I correct myself and say, he's an interesting character, but the groundwork on the character isn't made. We get a little flashback, and again, it isn't enough. And you do feel that there's a good story and there's good characters in there somewhere, but it's the lack of good execution that really takes away the effect of everything. So in the end, when you get to the fighting and all of that in this movie, it looks good, but you don't feel it. You don't feel the emotions of it. It was sad that Gunnar died in the end. I did like the funerals for the people in the end, and I liked the reveal that the princess is still alive. Actually, before that was done, I could have swore that she was going to turn up and bring Gunnar back to life or something stupid like that. But basically, if they do find her, if Zack gets an opportunity to do more movies, he's talking about 6 movies. But I don't know if Netflix are going to green light that. Of course, he can go to someone else. There's rumours about him doing an A24 movie, which would really upset a lot of the haters. So I say bring it on. I'm a big fan of his. But I think, this story, this sequel as well, is a missed opportunity. Because when you're telling these stories, clearly, the sequel isn't the final act because of the reveal of the princess being alive. So this is your middle story. And the best stories and in a really good kind of dark way, in a way. This did as well, in a way. It was sad and everything, but, the way Empire finishes, the way The Dark Knight finishes, I don't think it's, look, I don't think it's one of those sequels, and I don't think it's going to be hailed this way. As I say, Zack Snyder is a unique visual director, and I think if he worked for other people, if he was making movies for other people, based on other people's stories, and someone's kind of policing him, I think he would get a lot more credit than he does. He gets credit for Man of Steel, even though Man of Steel isn't everyone's cup of tea, but at least it's not really his story. The visual narrative is, of course, his, and he has much more control over BVS. But Chris Terrio, as I say, is a really good writer. So I think these are the issues here that I think this sequel really drops the lead. And it's a shame, because what it is with me, I'm a big fan of Zack's, but I'm not a stan. And there's a difference between a fan and a stan. A stan will just say everything's great. I'm quite happy to constructively criticize people I admire, such as Zack Snyder. And that's the nuance of this review. That ultimately, this film has character problems in it, because it doesn't fill out the movie with character development. It does it. It tries to character develop. And some people will say to me, Mick, there's character development in this film. What are you talking about? There is, but it's lazy character development. And it's typical of someone who's more obsessed with the visuals and the action, just wants to waste time in the early part of the movie till we get to the action, right? So basically, we don't get the character development we want. All that time they're wasting, picking up the harvest and doing all that, we could be doing other things. But I think that's the problem from the first film. We needed to start at an earlier stage of these characters' stories and bring them together slowly. I suppose it's a little bit like Game of Thrones, when you see the early seasons of Game of Thrones, not all the characters meet up. I mean, Tyrion and, I forgot her name now, the mad dragon lady, right? I mean, they don't meet till the later seasons, do they? It's a build-up. You learn about Tyrion's character and struggle with his family. You get different characters, and nobody meets up to the later seasons. And I think this is exactly what Rebel Moon needed. To start off developing, start off Cora from being found as a child, and, her life and all of that, doing all those bad things. And, the different characters on the farm, just everything, all these different characters. Nemesis. We could have had a really good time seeing more of Nemesis' backstory. And I think if it was done more early seasons of Game of Thrones like, I think this could have worked. And then these characters could come together in the sequel. And then the big fight and, having to, stop Noble. So I think there's an interesting story there. There's potentially interesting characters. There's good actors there, right? So it's all there, but it's poor execution. And then you have to ask the question, why? Why is this the case? And, I know that art is subjective, and some of you, maybe all of you, maybe I'm singing alone, on the hill about this, but why is that? Because maybe when we see, now this is an interesting thing, and this is the point that I made at the beginning. It's a difficult movie. Both movies are difficult movies to review because there's director's cuts, right? So my criticism of not starting in the right place may be fixed in the 6-hour director's cut. But that isn't good enough, because I can only judge these movies on what we've seen so far. And I don't know when these director's cuts happen, when we see them. So I will watch them. I will definitely watch them, because I want to see what we missed. And I just don't hope, I hope it's not people just banging, having sex, walking around naked. That will be disappointing. But I do feel a lot of the criticisms will be dealt with in these director's cuts. But this has always been the case with Snyder. he gets criticised for a film, you get a director's cut. Now, to be fair, Justice League isn't his movie. It's portions of his movie rejigged, right? And shut down, basically. So that's not Zack's fault. But Batman vs Superman needed an extra half an hour. But again, that's not Zack's fault that the movie got cut. But this is an issue. This was a decision made by Zack and Netflix to put out 2 hours and then give us more of the movie. So what happens here is all the people who want to shit talk Zack can shit talk, because all the stuff that maybe makes the film better and deals with the criticisms that I've put forward in this review may be fixed, most probably will be fixed. That doesn't give me a big L, because everyone out there can only judge these films on the merits that they've seen them in. The truth is, not many people like the first movie. And here's the interesting thing. A lot of Zack's fans weren't big fans of the first movie. And that's an interesting thing as well. I actually thought the first movie was much better than the second movie. I thought it had a better balance, it had better pacing. But the first half of this sequel is verging on boring. And I'm sorry to say that. And I suspected with the clips that we saw, the clips that we saw for the sequel after the first movie, I suspected that this could happen. That it was just time wasting. Maybe in the director's cut we'll get more Ray Fisher as well. Because I'm thinking, why is he in this movie? Right? We barely see him. Maybe he just put him in the movie, created the character for him as a favour. I'm assuming that is the case. So certainly what I'm going to say to you is, when you see the director's cuts, you're going to say, you see, it's a much better movie. Why were people saying these things about it? Well, because they can only judge the movies on what they see. It's basically rinse and repeat. It's movies that look good, with interesting Zack Snyder-y cinematography, with certainly too much slow-mo, but that's not a deal breaker for me. But I think he did go too far with the slow-mo. And in both movies, actually. So we'll see what we get in the director's cuts. But ultimately, this is why this idea doesn't work. Make a movie, cut it down to 2 hours, then show an expansive director's cut. As I said earlier, to do that, you've got to know where to edit it so it makes sense, that you're not losing certain things. But ultimately, that's the core idea. To lose some important things so people have something else to see when it comes to the director's cut. It's all marketing in the end of the day. It's another excuse to go onto Netflix and watch something that people are talking about. And I understand it. After all, it is show business. That's what it's called, right? But yeah, in the end, what you get is, because if all our criticisms are kind of dealt with in these director's cuts, then it makes the 2 hour cuts pointless. Because you can't make an omelette without putting eggs in the omelette, right? So you can't have a movie and condense it down for 2 hours. That barely makes sense. But I mean, it does make sense, but you can tell there's so much cut from it, from the narrative. And as I say, maybe we see Cora earlier on in her time in the first movie. We don't just start off at the farm. I hope that's the case, because that is a core criticism of mine, that the story starts in the wrong place. That serves the first movie well, but when you get to the second movie, there's all that time wasting because it doesn't know what to do. Or, even worse, it's so fillery because all the good stuff is in the director's cut. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough, because it makes the 2 hour version pointless, because it's not even something you have to look for. It's not something that you need to be a writer about. You don't need to make films, right? You don't need to be an expert on storytelling or filmmaking, right? To see that they're wasting about an hour in the first hour of this film. And that's the problem. And yes, I was bored in the early stages of this film. And I think if you're saying you wasn't bored in the early stages of this film. And the early stages of this film also misserved one big thing. Because as I say, Ed's Admiral Noble is the best thing about this story in general. Ed's performance is the best thing. I think he's the best actor on the production. And I know Sir Anthony Hopkins is there, but he plays a fleeting character. I mean, that robot, is it James? He's an interesting idea. Again, hopefully we get more of him in both of the director's cuts. But ultimately, I think, yeah, Admiral Noble is the most interesting thing. But there's another criticism for me. There wasn't much imagination in terms of these villains, these Motherworld people. They're basically space Nazis. And I understand that George Lucas also created, space Nazis. But it's not that blatant. This is too on the nose. The short back and the sides, the uniforms, it's too on the nose. There's no imagination. At least George uses the Emperor, the Empire, Vader, as an analogy, kind of the Nazis. But this is so on the nose. There's no concept around that. It's just typical of New Hollywood, typical of storytellers today. If they're not knocking you over their head with their points, with a hammer, they feel they can't make those points. And I think surely there's something more interesting to do with these villains than just make them space Nazis. So that was a problem with me in the first movie, but still, I still think Ed Skrein, again, if that's how you pronounce his surname, sorry Ed, but he is my favourite thing about both movies. But we barely see him. We only see him really in the second act a lot. And when he's on the screen, he shines. I don't think the idea of the villain is that great, but I do think the character and the actor himself makes it more than it is. Again, we don't know what we're going to get. I mean, we are talking about 6-hour director's cuts. I think I've got that right, that both movies are getting a 6-hour director's cuts each. If I've got that wrong, I do apologise. We're certainly getting that for the first movie. I'm not sure. I'm totally lost with the second movie. But yeah, I did prefer the first movie to the second movie. I am utterly disappointed. There will be people out there, YouTubers, critics, that will be very excited to criticise Zack Snyder. I take no pleasure from this. But as I say, I'm a fan and I'm not a stan, right? And I've said this about next year's Superman. I will tell you exactly what I see and how I feel about it. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. Films don't have to be the bestest ever. They don't have to be the worstest ever. They can just be there, right? And may be good or not very good. And this film, this sequel, unfortunately, is a letdown. And I was really looking forward to it because I felt they left the last movie in a good place. I absolutely loved the third act of the other one, the first one. I loved the twist when, what's his name? We realise he's a skank and he's grassed them up to the Motherworld, right? And, and they get ambushed. That's brilliant. I absolutely loved all of that. I thought the whole movie was okay. Not the best thing ever, but I enjoyed it. But this movie didn't have that. It didn't. What I'm going to say to you is this. The 2-hour cut of this sequel isn't a good movie. It has some interesting moments, but the first half is just dull, full of filler, padded out. And I felt insulted as a fan, and I felt let down by Zack Snyder for doing that. Because patter and filler is something that you do on purpose. And it's clearly because all the good stuff is in the director's cut. And I get that. Ultimately, this is what I would say to Netflix and all streamers in future, whether it's Zack Snyder or any other director. If you want to do a long drawn out movie, right? I mean, Gone with the Wind is 4 fucking hours, right? It is still. If you adjust, if you adjust the financials for modern day, it's still the most successful box office movie of all time. And that may be depressing for like shills of the MCU and Disney stands and people who think modern entertainment is so brilliant. You may be depressed to know that a 1939 movie is the biggest box office hit of all time if you adjust for inflation. So, if you want to do long movies, do fucking long movies. If you're not willing to do the long movies and put them on there, don't bother cutting them. Because what we've seen with more the sequel than the first movie is you get into trouble and you actually ruin the idea of the movie.